In early April 1947, the Rouge River began to rise. For 2 days, rain fell steadily across southeast Michigan, soaking the ground, swelling tributaries, and pushing the river beyond anything Dearborn had recorded in living memory. By the evening of April 7th, floodwaters were tearing through the Rouge Valley, uprooting trees, collapsing banks, and overwhelming the infrastructure built to restrain it. Telephone poles toppled, roads disappeared. The river that had once been carefully measured, dammed, and disciplined was no longer responding to human design. Along its banks stood Fair Lane, the private estate of Henry Ford, a house conceived not as a retreat, but as a system. For more than 30 years, Fair Lane had drawn its power directly from the Rouge River. Beneath the property, water was diverted through a dam into turbines housed in a limestone powerhouse, generating electricity not only for the mansion, but for surrounding parts of Dearborn itself. The estate had never depended on the municipal grid. It had never gone dark. That night it did. As floodwaters surged past the dam, the powerhouse began to fill. The turbines slowed, then stopped. One by one, the lights inside the 56-room mansion flickered and died. Fair Lane fell silent. Servants moved quickly through darkened corridors, lighting candles and kerosene lamps. Firelight replaced electricity, throwing long shadows across limestone walls and carved wooden ceilings. Upstairs, Henry Ford lay in his bedroom. He was 83 years old. The man who had helped electrify America, who had turned energy into industry and motion into empire, now lay illuminated only by flame. Outside, the river roared past in the darkness, louder than it had ever been during his lifetime. Somewhere below, the machines he had trusted more than people sat useless and drowned. At his side was Clara Ford, his wife of nearly 60 years. The telephone lines were down. When Henry told her he felt unwell, Clara did what she had always done. She acted. She sent the chauffeur out into the storm to find a doctor despite the flooding and the darkness. She called for the household staff. She stayed with him as the house, built to function without the outside world, failed to do so. Help could not reach them in time. Shortly before midnight, Henry Ford suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. At 11:40 p.m. on April 7, 1947, he died, by candlelight, in an unheated room, listening to the sound of water rushing past the estate he had built to tame it. The irony was complete. The man who had transformed the 20th century through machines, systems, and power died under conditions that would have been familiar to his parents in the 1860s. No electricity, no modern technology, just fire, darkness, and a river moving on its own terms. Fair Lane had been designed as a declaration that with enough engineering, enough control, and enough foresight, dependence could be eliminated. That nature, time, and uncertainty could be managed like an assembly line. That night proved otherwise. Fair Lane was built to be self-sufficient. On the night it mattered most, it wasn't. Before there was an empire, before factories and fortunes, there was Clara Bryant Ford, and a temperament forged long before she met her husband. Clara was born on April 11, 1866, in rural Wayne County, Michigan, the eldest daughter in a family of 10 children. She grew up on a working farm where usefulness mattered more than sentiment, and where idleness was a liability. From an early age, she learned discipline, endurance, and the quiet authority that came from competence. Clara was not raised to wait for life to unfold. She was raised to manage it. Social life in rural Michigan was limited, but not absent. Dances at inns and taverns offered rare opportunities to meet young men from neighboring communities. It was at one of these gatherings in 1885 that Clara met Henry Ford. He was 22, thin, intense, and already preoccupied with machines in a way that set him apart. Where other men talked about land or horses, Henry talked about engines, mechanics, and motion. To many, he sounded impractical, restless, unfocused, unfit for farm life. Clara heard something else. Possibility. They married in 1888, on Clara's 22nd birthday, and began their life together on farmland Henry's father had given them. For their first home, Henry cut and milled the lumber himself, constructing a small, square farmhouse that Clara helped design. It would later be known as the Henry Ford Square House, though at the time it was simply where they tried to live the life expected of them. Henry struggled with that life almost immediately. He disliked farming, resented routine labor, and spent his evenings in a small workshop instead of in the fields. Clara adapted. She brought him meals while he worked. She held lanterns so he could see. When neighbors whispered that her husband was wasting his time on foolish contraptions, she neither defended him loudly nor discouraged him quietly, as she absorbed the doubt and kept going. In 1891, Clara agreed to a decision that would strip away the last illusion of stability. They left the farm and moved to Detroit, so Henry could work as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. The move meant rented rooms, financial uncertainty, and a newborn son, Edsel, arriving soon after. It also meant opportunity. Henry disappeared into his experiments almost immediately. In a brick shed behind their rented home, he worked night after night on a gasoline engine. Clara was present for the moment that would later become legend. On Christmas Eve, 1893, as snow fell outside and their infant son slept inside, Henry finished assembling the engine. Clara stood beside him and dripped gasoline into the intake while he spun the flywheel. The machine sputtered, then roared to life, filling the room with noise and fumes. Clara called it wonderful. This was not blind devotion. It was informed commitment. Clara understood the risks, she understood the cost, and she chose to invest anyway, emotionally, practically, and repeatedly, when there was no guarantee of return. Through failed companies, unpaid bills, and long nights alone, she remained steady. Years later, Henry would give her a title that history remembered. He called her the Believer. But belief implies passivity. Clara's faith was not passive. It was operational. She made Henry's work possible by absorbing instability, shielding him from doubt, and refusing to treat uncertainty as a verdict. She wasn't following Henry into the future. She was financing it with faith. Long before his name became synonymous with progress, Henry Ford was known in Detroit for something else entirely: instability. By the mid-1890s, Ford was already a skilled engineer with an obsessive focus on internal combustion engines. His work at the Edison Illuminating Company gave him credibility and a modest income, but his real ambition lived elsewhere. He believed the future belonged to a machine that most Americans still considered a novelty, a gasoline-powered vehicle that could replace the horse. The idea was not unique. Dozens of inventors across the United States and Europe were experimenting with automobiles. What separated Ford from the others was not immediate success, but stubborn fixation. In 1899, that fixation attracted money. A group of Detroit businessmen formed the Detroit Automobile Company around Ford's designs. On paper, it was a breakthrough: capital, facilities, and backing from influential investors. In practice, it was a disaster. The investors wanted a sellable product quickly. Ford wanted perfection. He continually redesigned components, delayed production, and refused to release cars he believed were not ready. The vehicles that did leave the factory were expensive, unreliable, and slow to build. Within 2 years, the company collapsed. Ford blamed the businessmen. The businessmen blamed Ford. Almost immediately, another opportunity followed. In 1901, a new group of investors launched the Henry Ford Company, again placing Ford at its center. Once again, conflict was inevitable. Ford clashed with his backers over authority and direction. When the investors brought in an outside engineer to evaluate operations, Ford took it as an insult. He walked away from the company entirely. What remained reorganized without him? Under new leadership and new ideas, the company would soon rename itself Cadillac. In the span of 3 years, Henry Ford had failed twice, publicly. He had lost companies, money, and credibility. More damaging than any financial loss was the pattern taking shape in his mind. Each failure reinforced the same conclusion: other people could not be trusted. Investors interfered. Executives questioned him. Systems slowed him down. Control, Ford believed, was the problem. He did not retreat. He recalibrated. Instead of trying to convince businessmen, Ford decided to convince the public. He turned to racing, not as sport, but as spectacle. In 1902, he built a massive racing car known simply as the 999, named after a famous New York Central locomotive. The machine was crude, dangerous, and brutally fast. Ford himself refused to drive it at full speed, so he hired a bicycle racer named Barney Oldfield, a man with no prior experience behind the wheel of an automobile. Within days, Oldfield mastered the machine. At a race in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, the 999 defeated Alexander Winton, the most successful automobile manufacturer and racer in America at the time. Newspapers across the country reported the upset. Henry Ford's name suddenly appeared in headlines not as a failed entrepreneur, but as a visionary engineer capable of beating the best in the business. The transformation was immediate. Reputation succeeded where persuasion had failed. Investors returned, not because Ford was cooperative, but because he was now famous. What Ford took from this period was not humility. It was confirmation. He concluded that the world responded to power, not consensus, to results, not collaboration. Racing had restored his standing, but it had also hardened his instincts. He had survived by bypassing institutions, outmaneuvering partners, and proving others wrong in public. These lessons would shape everything that followed: how he ran factories, how he treated workers, how he designed systems, and how he built a Aussie meant to answer to no one. Ford did not emerge from failure with resilience. He emerged with distrust. On June 16, 1903, Ford Motor Company was incorporated in Detroit with $28,000 in cash and 12 investors. Henry Ford owned a minority stake, but he controlled the engineering and, increasingly, the philosophy. He had learned from his earlier failures. This time, he would tolerate investors only as long as they stayed out of his way. The company's early years were experimental and uneven. Ford and his engineers released a rapid succession of vehicles, Model A, B, C, F, N, each an attempt to balance engineering ideals with commercial reality. Some models sold modestly, others failed outright. What mattered was the lesson Ford absorbed from the chaos. Americans would buy automobiles if they were cheap enough, simple enough, and strong enough to survive terrible roads. From that realization came a radical decision. Instead of building cars for the wealthy, Ford would build a single car for everyone else. In October 1908, Ford Motor Company introduced the Ford Model T. It was not elegant. It was not fast. It had a hand crank that could break an arm if mishandled, thin brakes, and a suspension that rattled endlessly over dirt roads. But it had something no other car offered at scale: forgiveness. Farmers could repair it themselves. Parts were interchangeable. The engine tolerated abuse. The chassis survived mud, ruts, and neglect. Most importantly, it was affordable. Demand exploded almost immediately. Orders flooded in faster than Ford could fill them. But success exposed a new problem. Each Model T was still being assembled largely by hand. Skilled craftsmen moved from station to station, performing multiple tasks on each vehicle. The process was slow, inconsistent, and vulnerable to bottlenecks. Customers waited months. Production could not keep up with ambition. Ford's solution came not from another inventor, but from a slaughterhouse. In Chicago, meatpacking plants use D-overhead conveyors to move carcasses past workers, each performing a single cut before the body moved on. It was a disassembly line. Ford's engineers realized the logic could be reversed. Instead of workers moving to the product could move to the workers. In 1910, Ford opened a new factory at Highland Park Plant, designed by architect Albert Kahn. The building itself reflected Ford's evolving worldview. Vast open floors, massive windows, and a layout designed for reconfiguration rather than tradition. Ford called it the Crystal Palace. Inside, experimentation began. In April 1913, engineers tested a moving line for assembling magnetos. One man added one part, then pushed the assembly to the next station. Production time fell from 20 minutes to 13. Further refinements reduced it to 5. Encouraged, Ford applied the system to the entire chassis. Conveyors were installed. Tasks were broken down into precise, repeatable motions. Workers no longer walked. The line moved continuously, indifferent to fatigue or hesitation. The results were staggering. A Model T that once took more than 12 hours to assemble now rolled off the line every 93 minutes. Productivity surged. Costs collapsed. At launch, a Model T sold for $850. By 1913, the price had dropped to $550. By the time production ended in 1927, the price would fall as low as $260. Ford did not just undercut competitors, he erased them. Between 1908 and 1927, more than 15 million Model Ts were produced, nearly half of all automobiles in the world. America reorganized itself around the machine. Cities expanded, rural isolation shrank, courtship, commerce, labor, and leisure all bent around the automobile. Ford did not merely dominate a market, he reshaped daily life. But the assembly line did more than transform manufacturing. It transformed Henry Ford. The line rewarded obedience, repetition, and predictability. It punished deviation, complexity slowed it down. Human variability threatened efficiency. Ford watched as machines enforced discipline better than managers ever could. In steel and motion, he found moral clarity. What worked on the facto, rye floor, Ford concluded, should work everywhere. People, like parts, functioned best when standardized. Systems mattered more than individuals. Control was not cruelty, it was optimization. If a process produced results, it was justified. If it did not, it was waste. This belief would follow Ford far beyond the factory gates, into wages, into private lives, into architecture, and eventually into the house he would build along the Rouge River. Efficiency had solved his problems. Efficiency became Henry Ford's moral framework. By the end of 1913, Ford Motor Company was producing automobiles at a pace the world had never seen. The moving assembly line had solved Ford's manufacturing problem, but it created a human one. The work was relentless. Men stood in one place for hours, performing the same motion thousands of times as the line dragged unfinished cars past them. The job required little skill, no creativity, and absolute compliance with the machine's rhythm. Many workers lasted days, some lasted hours. By late 1913, Ford's annual labor turnover had reached nearly 380%. The company was hiring tens of thousands of men a year just to keep the lines moving. Efficiency was devouring itself. On January 5, 1914, Henry Ford and his vice president James Couzens made an announcement that stunned the nation. Ford Motor Company would pay its workers $5 a day, more than double the prevailing industrial wage, and reduce the workday from 9 hours to 8. Newspapers erupted. The Wall Street Journal called it reckless. Business leaders accused Ford of destabilizing American industry. Competitors warned it would collapse under its own generosity. None of them understood the calculation. The $5 day was not charity, it was leverage. Ford understood that the assembly line demanded a new kind of worker, one who would endure monotony in exchange for security. High wages would buy loyalty. Stability would reduce turnover. And workers who could afford automobiles would become customers for the very cars they built. The effect was immediate. The morning after the announcement, more than 10,000 men crowded outside Ford's employment office in Detroit. By the second day, 15,000 had gathered. Fights broke out. Police used fire hoses to control the crowd. Ford responded by restricting hiring to men who had lived in Detroit for at least 6 months. Inside the factories, the change was dramatic. Turnover collapsed. Productivity climbed. Men who had once drifted in and out of industrial work now competed to stay. But the $5 day came with conditions. Workers did not automatically receive the full wage. Base pay remained $2,034 a day. The additional $2,666 was classified as profit sharing, and eligibility depended on behavior. Single men under 22 were excluded. So were women, regardless of age or family circumstance. Women would not qualify until 1916, after sustained public pressure. Even for eligible workers, the bonus had to be earned. To enforce its standards, Ford created the Sociological Department, a private investigative unit with unprecedented authority over employees' lives. Inspectors visited workers' homes without warning. They examined cleanliness, finances, and family arrangements. They questioned neighbors. They monitored drinking habits, gambling, and domestic stability. Immigrant workers were required to attend company-sponsored classes in English and American customs. The message was unambiguous. Ford did not merely employ men, he judged them. Those who failed inspections were given 6 months to reform. Those who failed again were fired. Ford saw nothing sinister in the system. He believed that high wages justified high standards, and that shaping workers into disciplined, sober, orderly citizens was a moral good. To Ford, the factory was an extension of the assembly line. Personal behavior, like mechanical motion, could be optimized. Many workers disagreed. They resented the intrusion, but endured it. The money was too good to refuse. Surveillance became a cost of survival. The results, from Ford's perspective, were undeniable. Profits soared. By 1916, Ford Motor Company was earning more than $60 million a year. The $5 day became one of the most famous labor policies in history, cited as proof that high wages and high profits could coexist. What the headlines missed was the trade-off. Ford had proven that control worked, that systems could reshape behavior, that with enough oversight, human variability could be suppressed in the name of efficiency. The sociological department would eventually fade, dismantled by public criticism and legal pressure, but the underlying philosophy remained. Ford had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer content to build machines that organized labor. He wanted to organize life itself. Ford didn't just build cars. He engineered lives. By 1914, Henry Ford had achieved something few men in history ever experienced. His ideas no longer belonged to him. The Model T had turned Ford into a symbol of progress, wealth, and opportunity. His name appeared in newspapers across the country. His decisions shaped labor debates, business practices, and the physical movement of millions of Americans. Success brought power. It also brought intrusion. The house Henry and Clara Ford built on Edison Avenue in Detroit had once felt like a refuge. By the time of the $5 day, it had become a liability. Within hours of the wage announcement, crowds gathered outside their front door. Job seekers lined the sidewalks from morning until night. Strangers rang the bell at all hours, pleading for work, demanding meetings, or simply trying to see the man whose name promised salvation. The Fords could no longer leave their home without being surrounded. For Clara, the attention was intolerable. She had endured years of uncertainty, financial risk, and public skepticism. What she could not accept was the permanent invasion of private life. For Henry, the problem cut deeper. He had built systems to eliminate friction, machines that moved smoothly, predictably, and without interruption. Fame was chaos. It resisted control. The solution to Henry was obvious. He would leave. Not temporarily, not symbolically. He would withdraw from the city entirely and rebuild his life on his own terms. 2 miles from the farm where he had been born, along a stretch of the Rouge River he had known since childhood, lay land that still felt untouched by the modern world. Between 1908 and 1910, Ford quietly began buying it. Woodland, meadows, working farms, until he controlled more than 1,300 acres. This was not a fashionable choice. Other industrialists favored grand lakefront estates along Lake St. Clair or Lake Erie, places designed to impress peers and host society. Dearborn offered none of that. What it offered was memory. For Henry, the Rouge River Valley was personal. It was where he had fished as a boy, where his parents had struggled, where self-reliance was not an ideal but a necessity. For Clara, it felt like home in a way no elite neighborhood ever could. She had grown up not far away, in the same agricultural world Henry had tried to escape and never truly left behind. The land was more than an escape from attention. It was a reset. Here, Ford could design an environment instead of reacting to one. He could build a residence that answered only to him. a place that did not rely on city utilities, public services, or outside systems. The house would generate its own power, grow its own food, and function independently of the world beyond its gates. What Henry Ford was planning was not retreat, it was consolidation. The fame that followed him into Detroit could not follow him into the woods. The demands of the public could be shut out. The inefficiencies of society could be replaced with order. The house along the Rouge River would not simply shelter him from the world, it would filter it. Ford didn't want distance. He wanted insulation. When Henry Ford decided to build his estate along the Rouge River, he did what powerful men always do when they believe a project will define them. He reached for the most famous name available. In 1909, Ford approached Frank Lloyd Wright, the most influential architect in the United States. Wright's prairie style had already reshaped American domestic architecture, rejecting Victorian excess in favor of long horizontal lines, open interiors, and buildings that appeared to grow naturally from the land. A Ford commission would have been the largest residential project of Wright's career. On paper, it was a perfect match. Ford, the industrial revolutionary, Wright, the architectural one. The partnership never happened. That same year, Wright detonated his own career. He abandoned his wife, his 6 children, and his Oak Park studio to flee to Europe with the wife of one of his clients. The scandal made national headlines. Clients fled. Wright's practice collapsed almost overnight. Whatever preliminary discussions had existed between Ford and Wright dissolved quietly. Control slipped away before construction even began. The project passed to Herman von Holst, a competent but unremarkable architect tasked with completing Wright's abandoned commissions. Von Holst understood something crucial. He could not design a prairie masterpiece on his own. So he turned to the person who had done much of that work in the shadows for years. Her name was Marion Mahoney Griffin. Mahoney was one of the first licensed female architects in the United States, and Frank Lloyd Wright's first employee. For more than a decade, she had produced the stunning watercolor renderings that made Wright's work famous, often without credit. She understood prairie style more deeply than anyone alive. When von Holst offered her the Ford project, she accepted on one condition: full control of the design. For 2 years, Rs. Mahoney worked on Fair Lane. She envisioned a low horizontal structure anchored to the riverbank, with bands of windows dissolving the boundary between interior and landscape. It was restrained, modern, and unapologetically prairie, a house that would belong to Michigan rather than dominate it. In early 1914, she presented the final designs. They were rejected. The reasons were never formally recorded, but the consequences were unmistakable. Mahoney was dismissed. Her plans were discarded. The most likely source of the rejection was not Henry, but Clara Ford. Clara had traveled extensively in Europe and admired traditional English manor houses, structures that communicated stability, permanence, and lineage. Prairie modernism, with its stripped-down lines and quiet radicalism, did not align with her vision of a family home. Unlike Henry's factories, this house would represent her domain, and Clara Ford did not relinquish authority easily. For the first time, Henry Ford lost control of a major design decision. Clara selected the replacement herself. William Van Tyne, an interior designer from Pittsburgh with little architectural pedigree. The Fords were cautious enough to hire a detective agency to investigate him. The report described Van Tyne as financially unreliable and professionally inconsistent. They hired him anyway. Van Tyne took Mahoney's rejected prairie foundation and reshaped it. He retained the low profile and landscape integration, but layered on medieval and Gothic elements Clara preferred: stepped parapets, heavy stonework, and a round castellated tower facing the river. The result defied easy classification. Architectural critics later called it Prairie Gothic, a hybrid of modern restraint and old-world symbolism. Construction began in 1914 and dragged on through disputes, redesigns, and contractor changes. By the time the house was completed in late 1915, it encompassed 56 rooms, 31,000 square feet of Indiana limestone, thick masonry walls, and an unmistakable sense of contradiction. Fair Lane was not the house Henry Ford would have built if control had remained absolute. It was not the house Marion Mahoney Griffin had envisioned. It was a negotia, Ted object, shaped by power, preference, and unresolved tension. The estate that was supposed to embody independence began its life compromised. Fair Lane was born from compromise and resentment. To understand what Fair Lane was meant to be, it is necessary to understand the relationship that shaped its core, not the house itself, but the system that made it live. In August 1896, a young Henry Ford attended a convention of the Association of Edison Illuminating Companies in Brooklyn. Ford was 33, an obscure engineer working for the Detroit Edison subsidiary. Thomas Edison was 49, already the most famous inventor in the world. During a dinner, someone mentioned that a junior engineer had been building a gasoline-powered carriage. Edison asked to meet him. Ford sketched his design on the back of a menu. When he finished explaining how it worked, Edison slammed his fist on the table. "Young man," he said, "that's the thing. You have it." Ford would later say that moment mattered more than any investment he ever received. Validation from Edison gave him something money never could: certainty. The two men remained close friends for the next 35 years. Yes. Edison became Ford's model, not just as an inventor, but as a man who bent natural forces into obedient systems. When Ford began planning Fair Lane, he asked Edison to help design the heart of the estate, not the living spaces, not the architecture, the power. Along the Rouge River, workers constructed a dam that diverted water into a 4-story limestone powerhouse designed to visually mirror the main residence. The message was deliberate. This was not a utility shed. It was as important as the house itself. Inside, massive turbines spun continuously, driven by the river's current. The generators produced roughly 110 kilowatts of electricity, enough to power the entire estate and still feed surplus energy back into the municipal grid. Fair Lane did not draw power from the city. It supplied it. Ford had reversed the usual relationship. Instead of relying on public infrastructure, he made the pub. Like incidental. The powerhouse was not limited to electricity. The ground floor housed a 12-car garage equipped with a rotating automotive turntable, allowing vehicles to be moved without reversing. A small but telling expression of Ford's obsession with efficiency. Above it, Ford installed a private laboratory where he conducted experimental work on engines and mechanical systems. Access was restricted. A locked gate blocked the stairs. Only a handful of trusted associates were permitted inside. Thomas Edison himself laid the cornerstone of the building. A bronze plaque still marks the dedication. From the powerhouse, a 300-foot underground tunnel ran beneath the gardens and into the main house. The passageway was arched in stone, resembling something closer to a medieval crypt than a modern service corridor. Staff used it to move between buildings unseen. Doors branched off to the indoor swimming pool, the bowling alley, and mechanical rooms that kept the estate operational. Everything about the system communicated the same idea: independence without exposure. Fair Lane generated its own power. Its greenhouses produced vegetables year-round. Its farm supplied meat and dairy. The estate functioned as a closed loop, insulated from disruption. Ford had built not just a residence but an ecosystem. This obsession with self-sufficiency was not decorative. It was psychological. Ford had grown up on a farm where families survived by providing for themselves. He had watched his mother die when he was 12 and his father struggle to maintain the household afterward. Dependence to Ford was vulnerability. Fair Lane would have none. Visitors often remarked that while Clara preferred the sunlit rooms of the main house, the gardens, the music room, the spaces meant for people, Henry was happiest in the powerhouse. He spent hours there listening to the turbines, watching water move through stone channels, surrounded by machinery that did exactly what it was designed to do. The machines never argued. They never resisted. They never disappointed. The irony was subtle but absolute. In trying to eliminate reliance on the world, Ford recreated it, compressed, controlled, and mechanical. The river flowed when allowed. Power existed because it was harnessed. Life at Fair Lane functioned because systems enforced order. Ford believed he had finally built something perfect. A place that could not betray him, a structure that answered only to engineering. But perfection, like efficiency, depends on conditions remaining stable. Fair Lane was not a home in the traditional sense. It did not exist to shelter unpredictability or accommodate weakness. It existed to operate. This wasn't a home. It was Ford's final prototype. If the house at Fair Lane was Henry Ford's machine, the land around it was meant to be its proof. To shape that landscape, Ford turned to Jens Jensen, a Danish-born designer whose ideas stood in quiet opposition to everything industrial America admired. Jensen believed landscapes should not be imposed upon nature, but revealed from it. Where other estate planners imported exotic plants and rigid geometries, Jensen worked with native species, open horizons, and time itself. Ford was immediately drawn to him. Jensen had spent years restoring fragments of the Midwestern prairie that industrialization had erased. His philosophy was simple and radical. The land already knew what it wanted to be. The designer's role was restraint. At Fair Lane, Jensen found exhausted farmland stripped by decades of use. He began undoing the damage, reintroducing native grasses, oaks, hawthorns, and wildflowers that had defined the region long before factories arrived. Paths curved instead of marching straight. Meadows opened and closed like rooms. Trees were planted not for symmetry but for rhythm. The effect was deliberate naturalism, an environment that felt untouched, even though every detail had been planned. Jensen's most famous contribution was the entrance drive. Visitors approaching Fair Lane did not see the house at all. Dense woodland blocked every long view, forcing the road to wind slowly inward. Only at the final moment did the trees part, revealing the mansion in full. Jensen called it the delayed view, a technique designed to make arrival feel like discovery rather than conquest. Ford loved the precision of it. That precision extended beyond aesthetics. Jensen designed 2 long meadows aligned precisely with the summer and winter solstices. On the longest and shortest days of the year, the setting sun would align perfectly with narrow openings in the trees, flooding the landscape, with light along exact axes. Nature here functioned like a calibrated instrument. For Ford, this was irresistible. The same mind that admired assembly lines admired a sunset that arrived on schedule. His fascination with birds deepened the project. Ford was an avid birdwatcher, encouraged in part by his friendship with naturalist John Burroughs. At Fair Lane, Ford installed hundreds of birdhouses across the property and selected plants specifically to attract nesting species. He even imported English songbirds, hoping to establish them permanently in Michigan. The estate became a sanctuary, carefully curated, carefully controlled. A boathouse built along the river featured artificial stone cliffs designed to appear naturally eroded. Stepping stones crossed the top of the dam so Clara could walk easily between banks. Every element served function and illusion at once. Nature was allowed to flourish, but only within boundaries. What Ford did not notice was the contradiction taking shape. Jensen's philosophy rested on humility, on accepting that nature could not be commanded. Ford embraced the aesthetic while rejecting the premise. He admired wilderness most when it followed instructions. That tension would not remain theoretical. Fair Lane's landscape appeared wild, but it was never free. It was engineered as carefully as the turbines below it. And like every other system Ford trusted, it depended on conditions remaining stable. Ford believed he had learned how to live with nature. In truth, he had only learned how to choreograph it. Ford loved nature when it obeyed. For several years, the landscape at Fair Lane appeared to reflect harmony. Jens Jensen's meadows matured. Native grasses reclaimed open fields. The estate looked less like a designed property and more like land that had quietly remembered what it once was. But the balance was fragile. While Henry admired Jensen's philosophy and theory, Clara Ford never fully accepted it. She appreciated beauty, but not wildness. Where Jensen saw restraint as virtue, Clara saw neglect. She favored order, symmetry, and visible care, the kind of gardens that announced intention rather than conceal it. By the mid-1920s, Clara decided to impose her own vision. She commissioned a massive formal rose garden carved directly into land Jensen had deliberately restored as meadow. The project was the opposite of everything he believed in. Imported plants replaced native species. Geometric beds cut into organic contours, pergolas, stone bridges, ornamental ponds, and carefully aligned walkways imposed human will onto a landscape Jensen had spent years trying to liberate from it. When completed in 1926, the garden contained more than 10,000 roses across roughly 400 varieties. The cost exceeded $200,000, an enormous sum for what Jensen considered an aesthetic betrayal. For him, the message was unmistakable. This was not a disagreement over taste. It was a rejection of philosophy. The rose garden represented civilization reasserting dominance over nature, precisely the impulse Jensen had devoted his career to resisting. He could not stop the project, but he could refuse to participate. Jensen resigned. The departure was quiet, but the meaning was loud. Fair Lane could not accommodate both visions indefinitely. One believed beauty came from harmony with natural forces. The other believed beauty came from mastery over them. Jensen walked away rather than legitimize the latter. The irony was sharp. Henry F. Ord had embraced Jensen because he seemed to offer a version of nature that could be systematized, prairie as process, wilderness as design. Clara rejected that abstraction outright. She wanted gardens that looked cared for, controlled, and unmistakably human. The rose garden would not last. Over time, neglect and decay overtook its rigid geometry. Pergolas collapsed. Beds grew wild. Jensen's meadows endured. But the damage had already been done. The Garden War revealed what architecture and machinery had only hinted at. Fair Lane was not a unified vision. It was a negotiated space, held together by proximity rather than agreement. Even at Fair Lane, unity was an illusion. Each summer, at the height of their influence, 4 of America's most powerful men attempted something radical: disappearance. They called themselves the Vagabonds, a loose alliance formed by Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and the naturalist John Burroughs. What began in 1914 as an informal road trip quickly became an annual ritual. Each year, they packed their automobiles and vanished into rural America. No schedules, no speeches, no factories. At least that was the idea. For Ford, the trips represented a rejection of the world he had helped build. Factories ran on clocks. Cities pulsed with machines. Life had become measured, optimized, enclosed. Camping promised the opposite: unpredictability, discomfort, and contact with something unengineered. Around campfires, the men cooked their own meals, pitched tents, and slept outdoors. Burroughs delighted in the simplicity. Edison and Firestone treated it as novelty. Ford treated it as restoration. But the illusion never held. By the second year, reporters began following them. By the third, photographers staged scenes in advance. Special vehicles joined the caravan: kitchen trucks, supply wagons, support staff. A professional chef prepared meals. Electric lights illuminated campsites. What had begun as escape turned into spectacle. Burroughs noticed the change first. He wrote privately that the trips no longer felt like communion with nature but reenactment. The men performed ruggedness while surrounded by comfort. Even their hardships were curated. The outdoors had become another stage. Ford, ironically, helped accelerate the transformation. He enjoyed the attention, the symbolism of America's industrial titans pretending, however briefly, to live outside the system. Presidents eventually joined. Crowds gathered along routes. The vagabonds were no longer disappearing. They were touring. The final expeditions bore little resemblance to the first. Wives and servants joined. Luxury replaced improvisation. Burroughs died in 1921, and with him went the last sincere connection to wilderness. The remaining men continued for a few more years, but the ritual had hollowed out. By 1924, the trips ended entirely. What the vagabonds revealed was not Ford's love of nature, but his inability to inhabit it without structure. Even in the woods, he recreated systems. Even in freedom, he imposed order. The outdoors became another controlled environment, stripped of risk and surprise. The escape failed for the same reason everything else eventually did. It could not remain unscripted. Even freedom became a performance. By the end of the First World War, Henry Ford had reached a level of influence that extended far beyond factories and automobiles. His opinions were quoted as principles. His methods were studied as doctrine. When Ford spoke, millions listened, and he had begun to believe that they should. In 1918, Ford purchased a small weekly newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan, called the Dearborn Independent. Publicly, he claimed benign intentions. The paper, he said, would give voice to ordinary Americans, free from financial elites and political manipulation. Privately, it offered something Ford increasingly desired, a platform he could control completely. The paper's circulation initially hovered around 72,000. Ford fixed that problem quickly. Every Ford dealership in America was required to distribute subscriptions. Customers who bought a Ford automobile received the paper automatically. Within a few years, circulation approached 900,000, making it one of the most widely read publications in the country. In May 1920, The Independent began publishing a series of articles under a headline that would define Ford's moral collapse. The International Jew, the world's foremost problem. Week after week, the paper accused Jewish people of orchestrating global conspiracies, controlling banks, corrupting culture, provoking wars, undermining Christian civilization. The claims were repetitive, inflammatory, and demonstrably false. They were presented not as opinion, but as investigation. Ford did not write the articles himself. That task fell to editor William J. Cameron. But contemporaries were clear about the source of the ideas. The paper's original editor resigned rather than participate, later recalling that Ford talked about the Jews constantly, blaming them for nearly every social ill. The campaign ran uninterrupted for 91 consecutive weeks. The articles were then compiled into book form and published as a multi-volume set titled The International Jew. Translations appeared in at least 16 languages. What had begun as a local propaganda effort became global. The damage was immediate and profound. Ford was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most admired men on earth, a symbol of American ingenuity and success. When Henry Ford said something, it carried the authority of achievement. Millions believed him. Across the Atlantic, the message found an eager audience. In Germany, a rising political agitator named Adolf Hitler took notice. Hitler kept a portrait of Ford on the wall behind his desk. In Mein Kampf, published in 1925, he praised Ford as the only great man in America who had resisted Jewish influence. Ford was the only American mentioned favorably in the book. Later, Hitler told reporters that Ford had inspired him. This was not coincidence. It was amplification. Jewish organizations fought back. The Anti-Defamation League documented the falsehoods line by line. Protests spread. A boycott of Ford automobiles gained traction. Still, the paper continued. The end came not through conscience, but through courtrooms. In 1924, The Independent published an article accusing Aaron Shapiro, a Jewish attorney, of exploiting American farmers as part of a conspiracy. Shapiro sued Ford for libel. The trial dragged on for years, exposing the newspaper's methods and Ford's influence. As the case approached Ford's personal testimony in 1927, the risk became existential. Ford settled. On June 30th, 1927, he issued a public apology. The statement expressed regret that Jewish people had come to see him as an enemy and asked forgiveness for harm he had unintentionally caused. What the public did not initially know was that the apology had been drafted by Lewis Marshall, president of the American Jewish Committee. Ford signed it. He did not write it. Many accepted the apology cautiously, others did not. Their skepticism proved justified. Copies of The International Jew continued circulating for decades. Ford never made a comparable public effort to undo the damage he had done. In 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, the German government sent him a gift, the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. Ford accepted it. He never returned it. At the Nuremberg trials, former Nazi officials would later testify about the origins of their beliefs. One name surfaced repeatedly: Henry Ford. Ford lived long enough to see newsreels of concentration camps after the war. According to associates, he suffered a stroke after viewing the footage. Whether guilt followed is impossible to measure. Consequences, however, were already permanent. Ford had spent his life believing that scale magnified success, that systems, once perfected, could simply be expanded. He applied that logic to ideas, unaware or unwilling to accept that words, unlike machines, do not remain contained. Ford learned too late that machines aren't the only things that scale. By the 1930s, the culture Henry Ford had created no longer required his direct supervision. It had learned how to enforce itself. The man who embodied that transformation was Harry Bennett. Bennett arrived at Ford Motor Company in 1918, a former Navy sailor and professional boxer with a reputation for toughness and absolute loyalty. Ford valued both. Over the next 2 decades, Bennett made himself indispensable by positioning himself as Ford's personal protector and enforcer. Eventually, he became head of the company's service department, a unit that bore little resemblance to its benign name. At its height, Bennett's department commanded thousands of men. Many were former convicts, washed-up fighters, or hired muscle. They monitored workers, infiltrated meetings, intimidated organizers, and violently suppressed any talk of unions. Newspapers would later describe the service department as the largest private paramilitary force in the United States. Ford rarely gave explicit orders. He did not need to. Bennett understood what the system demanded. The crisis came on May 26, 1937. Union leaders from the United Auto Workers gathered at Gate 4 of the Rouge plant to distribute leaflets advocating unionization. Among them were Walter Reuther and several organizers. A photographer from the Detroit News asked them to pose beneath the Ford sign. Moments later, Bennett's men arrived. They stormed the overpass without warning. Reuther was slammed repeatedly against the concrete. Another organizer was thrown down a flight of stairs. A third suffered a broken back. The attackers attempted to destroy the photographer's film, but one roll was hidden and survived. The images ran nationwide the next day. They showed unarmed men being beaten by Ford employees under a company sign. The event became known as the Battle of the Overpass, and it shattered Ford's carefully managed public image. While General Motors and Chrysler had already recognized the United Auto Workers, Ford now stood isolated, defiant, violent, and exposed. Public outrage followed. Editorials condemned the brutality. Congressional scrutiny intensified. The myth of benevolent Fordism collapsed under photographic proof. Still, Henry Ford resisted. He insisted unions were unnecessary, that loyalty could be engineered without negotiation. But the system he had built was no longer responding to him. It was responding to pressure. In 1941, a strike shut down Ford's Rouge operations. Production halted. Violence loomed again. This time, the ultimatum came from inside Ford's own house. Clara Ford told her husband she would leave him if he did not sign a union contract. Ford relented. The agreement he signed granted workers better terms than those secured at rival companies. It was not generosity, it was containment. By then, the damage was irreversible. The service department remained. Bennett remained. The culture of fear Ford had enabled continued to function with mechanical efficiency. Henry Ford had built a system that enforced obedience without needing his hands on the lever. The system he built no longer needed him to be cruel. It did it automatically. The collapse of Henry Ford did not arrive suddenly. It came through erosion of authority, of judgment, and finally, of family. The blow that broke him came in 1943. On May 26th of that year, Edsel Ford, Henry's only child and the president of Ford Motor Company, died of stomach cancer at the age of 49. Publicly, the loss was mourned as a tragedy. Privately, it exposed a truth many inside the company already understood. Edsel had been carrying the weight his father could not release. For years, Henry had undermined his son, overruling decisions, humiliating him in front of executives, and allowing Harry Bennett to harass and intimidate him. Edsel had modernized Ford's designs, pushed for aesthetic improvement, and tried to drag the company into a changing market. His efforts were often blocked. Many believed the stress accelerated his decline. Edsel's own son, Henry Ford II, would later say that although cancer killed his father, his grandfather had destroyed him. After Edsel's death, Henry Ford, then 80 years old and already suffering the effects of multiple strokes, reclaimed the presidency of the company. It was a catastrophe. His memory failed. He could not recognize longtime associates. Decisions were made in his name by others, often without his understanding. Ford Motor Company hemorrhaged money, losing millions of dollars each month during wartime production. The situation became so dire that officials in the Roosevelt administration openly discussed nationalizing the company to ensure reliable output for the war effort. Inside the family, panic replaced loyalty. In 1945, Clara Ford and Edsel's widow confronted Henry with an ultimatum. If he did not relinquish control, they would sell their shares, an act that would strip him of power entirely. Faced with the unthinkable, Henry capitulated. On September 21, 1945, Henry Ford II, just 28 years old, he was appointed president of Ford Motor Company. His first priority was not production, it was purging. Harry Bennett was summoned and dismissed. The meeting nearly turned violent. Bennett and a security officer reportedly drew pistols on one another before Bennett was escorted out of the building. His two-decade reign of intimidation ended in a single afternoon. When Henry Ford was informed of Bennett's removal, he sat silently for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Well," he said, "now Harry is back where he started." It was not vindication. It was recognition. Henry Ford had built an empire on control, efficiency, and obedience. In the end, those same principles rendered him obsolete. The system had moved on without him. Ford outlived his usefulness, and he knew it. On the morning of April 7, 1947, Henry Ford began his day as he always had, inspecting. Despite his age and declining health, he was driven through Dearborn to survey flood damage along the Rouge River. He walked through the Rouge plant. He examined machinery. He boarded his freighter, Henry Ford II, newly returned from its first spring voyage. Those who saw him that day remarked on the same thing. He looked unusually strong, alert, almost restored. He made plans for the next morning, another tour, more inspections. The future, as always, was scheduled. By evening, the river had risen beyond control. Heavy rains overwhelmed the Rouge Valley, sending floodwaters surging toward Fairlane. Water breached the dam. The powerhouse filled. The turbines slowed, then stopped entirely. For the first time in decades, the estate lost power. The lights went out. Heat failed. The system Henry Ford trusted above all others collapsed in silence. Inside the mansion, servants lit candles and kerosene lamps. Firelight replaced electricity. Shadows moved along stone walls. Upstairs, Henry Ford lay in bed while the river he had harnessed roared past outside, indifferent. At his side was Clara Ford. Shortly before midnight, Henry told her he felt unwell. With telephone lines down and roads flooded, Clara sent the chauffeur into the storm to find a doctor. She called for help. She waited. None arrived in time. At 11:40 p.m. on April 7, 1947, Henry Ford died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 83 years old. The man who had electrified factories, reorganized time, and turned motion into wealth died by candlelight, in an unheated room, surrounded not by machines, but by fire and darkness. The conditions were no different from those of his birth on a Michigan farm more than 8 decades earlier. The news spread quickly. Detroit stopped. Factories closed, streetcars halted, gas stations shishambasent, down. Across the country, Ford plants fell silent. His body lay in state at Greenfield Village, where more than 100,000 people passed his casket over 2 days. An estimated 7 million Americans paused during his funeral. It was the largest public mourning Detroit had ever known. Clara Ford returned to Fairlane alone. She lived there quietly for 3 more years, walking the grounds, tending what remained, surrounded by a house that still functioned but no longer commanded. When she died in 1950, she was buried beside her husband. They had been married for 62 years. Today, Fairlane still stands. The powerhouse still exists. The river still moves through its grounds, flowing as it always has, sometimes calm, sometimes destructive, never obedient. Henry Ford believed the world could be engineered into permanence, that if systems were perfect enough, failure could be eliminated. In the end, it was not competition or critics or even history that defeated him. It was water, darkness, and time. If you found value in this story, if this deeper look at power, ambition, and consequence changed how you see the people who shaped the modern world, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, told without myth and without shortcuts, consider subscribing.